Welcome, everyone. I will make introductions in just a moment, but I wanted to take a minute and share with you the last few weeks of the class. I'll introduce Maureen in just one moment. As you know, she's speaking today about comparative urban politics. Alderman Scott Walsbeck wasn't able to be at the Chicago Future class today because he was voting on the city budget. He will be here instead on November 10th at noon. I will send a note about that. And Scott Alderman, the 25th Ward Alderman, Byron Secchio Lopez is going to be talking at noon on November 3rd. So I wanted to highlight those. Just in terms of the rest of the semester, next week, Evan McKenzie is going to be speaking about Beyond Privatopia and probably some about resilience as well because of his new book. You're to read Beyond Privatopia. The following week, Terry Clark and particularly Raymond Lodato are going to be talking about Bitter Fruit, Black Politics in the Chicago Machine. Raymond Lodato is finishing as co-author the book by Bill Grimshaw, which follows Bitter Fruit and is about the labor movement in Chicago. Then on the 17th of November, we will be discussing the study of corruption in Chicago and Illinois. On the 24th, before Thanksgiving, you will be reporting on your projects. And again, on December 2nd, we'll divide the class in half, but I won't take the time today to do that. Some of this I'll be updating you by email on the additional schedule. But so we have still a good bit of the course left, particularly covering comparative politics, private governments and privatopia, and a number of other important topics like how to study corruption. Today, though, I want to introduce Maureen Heffen-Panicki, who is successfully defended her dissertation just 2 weeks ago, less than 2 weeks now. So it's doctor, professor as well. She teaches at the College of DuPage. So for those of you that are partway through your degree, whether it's MA or PhD, indeed, this is a sign of hope that you can get all the way through and get done. Her research is particularly interesting. I've asked her to speak to us today about two aspects. One, why do we do comparative urban studies? And that's true whether you're in planning or whether you're in education or any of the other fields that you come from, including political science. The comparative approach to cities is very important. For instance, just to give an example out of planning, when we did the transition team report for Mayor Byrne and Mayor Washington, we've discovered that the great snow that elected Jane Byrne, there had been no plan for snow removal for the city of Chicago. We looked around and found that Toronto did do that kind of planning, and Chicago has since adopted it. And of course, that's the sole reason we've never had a problem like the great snow again. But it is useful to be able to get the insight of comparing cities, and instead of just the focus on one city. And part of the new Chicago School is comparative urban studies, not just one city. Maureen, I think I'll let you take over and talk both about comparative politics and particularly the issue of how cities become resilient and are able to recover from shocks, particularly important because we're just recovering from the pandemic and the economic recession. Welcome, Maureen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Just as Professor Simpson said, what I thought we'd do, first I kind of want to meet all of you, and then we'll talk about Intro to Comparative Urban and what it brings. I'll go over a little bit of my research, and then I'll talk about some key comparativists in the urban field that might be interesting to look at, and then we can have a discussion. Feel free to ask questions at any point and stop me. But I was thinking first, I was here on the first day, but it might be helpful if we just went around real quick and you could tell me, what you're studying, and if you have something that you definitely want to make sure that I talk about, and whether I can answer that or not, I don't know, but throw that out there. So why don't we just go around first?
Why don't we start with Daniel? You're the first on my screen.
Daniel Williams, third year political science PhD at UIC. My research is primarily focused on interest groups with a emphasis on how historically marginalized communities access the legislative process.
Great.
Just go ahead. Veronica, you're next on my screen, but if you guys will just jump in.
Hi, my name is Veronica. It's my first semester in the Masters of Public Administration, and I'm just interested to hear what you have to say about this topic.
Great.
Hi, Mitch Dickey with the Masters of Public Administration program as well. This is my second year, and I'm doing a concentration in financial management and economic development. And I'm interested really to hear if just comparatively how Chicago and our political spheres of influence look, if that's something that happens in other cities, and if the politics kind of spreads to its neighboring subdivisions and other cities.
Hi, my name is Ujay Park. I'm a second year political science PhD. I think I'm interested in urban politics and American politics. Excited to hear what you have to say about comparative politics. And yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name's Lupe. This is my second year as a student for Masters in Public Policy. I'm interested in general learn about women in politics and anything on immigration.
Hi, my name is Rodrigo. I'm a second year PhD urban planning student, and I'm interested to hear comparative tools in general. It's a very interesting topic. Thank you.
Hello, my name is David Morales. I'm a second year PhD student in political science. My interests are in urban and comparative politics.
Hi, I'm Ryan Bandari. I'm a third year PhD student in economics at UIC. My research interests so far have been on lobbying and the revolving door between Capitol Hill and K Street, looking at different demographic and financial factors that lead people to become lobbyists.
Hi, this is Jasmine Haiti. I'm a third year PhD student in political science. My interests lie at the intersection of urban and comparative politics. And I would be really curious to hear today, what are the different lenses through which we can compare cities, if there are like any particular things that are currently trending in the field?
Hi, I'm Becky Darling. I'm a second year master's student in urban planning. My focus is on economic development and cooperatives. So yeah, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say.
Hi, my name is Rodrigo. I'm a second year PhD student in the political science department. I would say in terms of urban and comparative, I'm particularly interested in hearing your stories about doing research in this field in terms of gathering data and figuring out how to compare cities with different institutional arrangements, that sort of issue. I'm also broadly interested in issues of redistribution and comparing services that the cities provide. And so I'm definitely interested in your class today.
I'm Scott Gregg. I'm a second year master's in urban planning and policy student. My concentrations are urban transportation and economic development, and I'm always open to new ideas and perspectives.
Okay, did we get everyone? I think so, right? Okay, terrific. Okay, thank you for doing that. It just helps me kind of situate who's in the room, to remember. I remembered when I was here the first day, I was so impressed with the wealth of information sitting here on this Zoom call. Okay, so let's see what we can cover. And again, as I say, feel free to stop me and ask questions. I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay, and all right, so what can comparison do for us? That is the question. And as you can guess, I'm going to say a heck of a lot. And so, first of all, the comparative method is the oldest tool in political science, dating back to Aristotle. And actually, comparative urban, they did a study of cities way back when. But it's got a very long tradition in political science. It's very intuitive. Why wouldn't we compare to understand why something happens in one place and not the other? I also think I often use the comparison to people say when you leave your own culture, it's only when you can understand your culture. And those of you who have crossed cultures and lived in other places will get that very viscerally, that it's only when leaving can we have a deeper understanding. I think of the comparative method similarly, like it's very hard to understand something when it's the only thing or you're enmeshed in it, and it's your, having that outside lens is very clarifying. As far as comparative in the urban politics, there's a long tradition in one city studies that frankly are phenomenal, that have brought us, Who Governs by Dahl, and asking really key questions about influence, and Clarence Stone with regime politics and understanding how cities work. So I think comparative is another thing to put into the toolbox, and doesn't necessarily always need to be used. But we also have a long tradition in urban politics of comparing US cities and US and European cities. So there's lots of data out there comparing that set of cities, which also makes sense because there's a lot of variables in common. So as I tell my students at the very introductory level, it's really hard for us as political scientists to control for just the insane amount of variables that could be influencing your outcome. So by comparing US and European cities, you at least are taking away a lot of moving parts. Nevertheless, we lose out when we don't go beyond that. And the field is really growing mightily in the direction of taking on the challenge of comparing the global North and the global South. I think, as I mentioned on my very first day, my initial kind of entree into all of this was this idea of cross-fertilizing ideas from the global North and global South, but from applied international development, making change on the grassroots level. Like, what can we learn from the folks? I lived in Peru for a couple of years. What can we learn from them that we're not doing in the US? And just kind of very aware that even at an applied level and a practitioner level, global North and global South are not talking to each other. It's slowly changing, but it's limited. And then getting to the academic side to look at knowledge production, I think you could argue that same thing, that we often are reaching out to see what we can learn. So while you're going to add way more variables, it's very hard to compare. There's a lot of risks methodologically. If we don't do it, we lose out on finding new knowledge and wisdom. So urban, which had always been situated more or less in the American field, comparative in its own field, you really see a bridging of those two fields now. As far as the comparative politics field, many of the studies, the tradition was the gaze was at the national level. So we wanted to understand difference by looking at national legislatures and national economic systems, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, more than half of the world's population now lives in cities, but cities are a distinctive political space. So that's kind of the concept of urban, right? So if for the comparative politics field, by not looking at cities, you're not understanding everything. And, there's a long tradition of, I think it was Guillermo O'Donnell, who, kind of said, even if you look at the city, you can look at the country, there's vast areas where the state doesn't even have access to. So urban is this beautiful way to come in from the grassroots, from the local, and see what's going on at really at the closest place to people's lived experience. So in comparative, you often hear them talk about subnational research. It is growing within the field. Richard Snyder has written a ton on the method of subnational research. So if you're interested in that, look him up. Ken Eaton, who's done a lot in Latin America at the subnational level, is another great author to look at. But, they argue that the reason for this is you want to spur theoretical innovation, which is what I just said, like, what don't we know by not going outside and comparing, and then deepen just substantive issues in general, and provide the multi-level analysis. So when you only look national, you're only seeing one thing. When you only look at one city, you're only seeing one thing. When you, in a federalist system, obviously we've got, city level, state, you may have regions embedded in there, national, obviously the international, and we all know, again, intuitively, we all know all of those levels impact our outcomes. But in the research side, we haven't always been as systematic as in including that multi-level analysis. We tend to, as researchers, I think, either go to one level or go the other, even though we know they all have an influence, but we need to be a little more systematic about looking at that. So by taking the comparative field down to the subnational, you can then talk about mayors and governors, which this class talks about a lot, local civic organizations, foundations, business community, et cetera. And that has often been just completely out of some of the comparative politics analysis. So that's to compare is to learn more. I think the three, there's lots of methods that we could talk about, but I just thought I'd just highlight three that are probably used most often: most similar systems design. And my research will give you an example of the most similar systems, but basically you want to take two cities that are as similar as possible on every single variable, but they differ on the outcome. And so that way you can control for as many variables as possible and really try to zone in on what are those explanatory factors. Most different systems is actually oftentimes more used in comparative urban, because if you compare a global north and a global south city, they're often very different systems. They may have the same outcome, but they're very different systems. So why do these very different systems have a similar outcome, and what can we learn from that? And then comparative historical analysis also has a very long history in political science as well. And the way I would sum that up, it is, if in the urban context, taking different cities, tracing back historically as long as you can, which of course, is depending on time and resources, but to go back and it's really obviously predicated on this idea that history influences a lot of outcomes and is unique to a certain area. So what I will show you in my research, what happened historically in Buffalo, New York, is different than what has happened historically in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And a national level analysis is not going to capture that. It means going to archives and really digging into the culture of each city. But by systematically looking at cities across time, patterns begin to appear. And I will be honest, that is one of the concepts I didn't understand till I did it. I heard it and I thought, okay, well, yeah, that it makes sense, but how? And how does that work? And then as I began looking at my three cities across time, you realize how patterns do appear, but you need to go back across time. So I'm just going to give you a short overview of what I did for my dissertation. My question was, why do cities bounce back from economic shock? Which, as Professor Simpson said, I was looking at deindustrialization, but obviously COVID-19 gives us a very current shock to have in our minds. But I am originally from Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York experienced deindustrialization fairly, it was pretty severe. And we didn't really bounce back. And so growing up, we were all, you're always like, why can't our city kind of find its route back? And so that in many ways was what kind of spurred the research. And then so I do a most similar systems design for Buffalo and Pittsburgh. Buffalo not bouncing back, Pittsburgh bouncing back. And then I take the findings from that initial most similar systems design, and then I do like a comparative check and see, does that hold in a Latin American city? And I use Cordoba, Argentina. And my dependent variable is resiliency. So then you might ask, well, what do you mean by resiliency? As you should ask. Resiliency measures the city's ability to respond to a systemic shock and to effectively adapt, leaving the city in as good of shape or better off than before it sustained the shock. And these are the variables that I use to assess if a city was resilient or not. And I'll point out that I especially take a 30-year time frame. So in the literature, the argument is that whereas a recession might have a shorter time frame when you would assess bounce back, for deeper structural changes such as deindustrialization, the longer time period is a better way to assess adaptation. Okay, so why does it matter? Economic shocks are going to keep on happening. We live in a market economy. We know this is part of the business cycle and many other things such as the pandemic. So I want to know how to do it better. If Buffalo, as you can see, has a, I'll tell you later, Buffalo has a 30% poverty rate now. And that's not okay, that we haven't learned how to figure, how to bounce back quicker because the, poverty persists. We know from many strands of research how devastating that is, especially for children and for marginalized communities especially. And also it fuels a rise in populism. So we better figure out how to bounce back better is my hope. What do we know so far about bounce back? We know that the global economy and restructuring has a powerful effect on cities. So there's no negating that while cities do have agency, they are very subject, obviously, to a very interconnected global economy. But despite that, there's variance in how cities bounce back. And that's kind of where I come in. Well, then what do we know? So we know a lot of political and economic research has found that if a larger city tends to bounce back faster, so we know the size of the city has some influence. We know innovation and social capital have also had some influence. Repeated studies link large stocks of human capital with a quicker adaptation. Obviously, industrial diversification. Sean Safford did a great study comparing Youngstown and Allentown and found that when the business and the civic networks were too overlapped, when business left, civic institution fell and they were not able to bounce back as quickly. Glaser argues that weather is important. And Saskia Sassen has talked about cities like Chicago who have built their new economy on the historical assets of the old economy tend to adapt better. But from all of that, what happens when you're a city with bad weather, like Buffalo? You're a medium-sized city, so you're not big, you didn't have a very industrialized economy to start with, and all of this. So say you don't have all of that. Is there any hope for that city? So it's nice that we find those correlations, but do we have any capacity to go overcome those constraints? And specifically, what role can governance? And governance I'm using broadly, which that will make sense, but it's not just mayors and city councils. It's also the other actors within society, business community, foundations, nonprofits, community development corporations, all of those. And so I use a small n. It's inductive because when I started the research, I had a couple hypotheses. And I went to started doing the interviews thinking, well, these are my breadcrumbs, but I don't really know the answer. That's kind of the whole point of research, right? And as I kept conducting interviews, a similar story and evidence kept emerging. And so my hypotheses changed. And then I started kind of taking those and going farther and looking for more evidence. As I mentioned, I start with Buffalo and Pittsburgh, and then I compare it to Córdoba, Argentina. I used primarily interviews, semi-structured, policymakers, business league, community leaders, et cetera. And then a lot of archival research, especially for the historical content, but also to check evidence that came out of interviews and all of that. So my four main, the 1 and 2 are the main hypotheses. The first one is that social connectivity, which I define as the collaboration between various non-state and state actors. When a city is connected, they bounce back faster. When the city gets support from its state government, in this case, they bounce back faster. If a city has a pattern of connectivity and a path dependency, they jump back on that path easier and bounce back faster. And when a city is highly connected, it actually acts as an intervening variable to help promote intergovernmental support. If the state wasn't going to give it, you have a highly connected city, they're able to get the state to act better than the others. I won't go into all of these. There's a list of all the different alternative hypotheses, which we can talk about if anybody has questions about those. So I'll just give you a quick snapshot of the cities. Here's the most similar systems design. 1980, Buffalo and Pittsburgh, two steel towns. Buffalo also had a lot of auto manufacturing, but similar sized. They both, as deindustrialization hit, they both lost almost 50%, or right around 50% of their population. Similar incomes, similar rates of tertiary education. So the human capital is similar when the shock hit, and poverty rate slightly higher in Buffalo, but similar. Then you go 30 years later. So there's my, well, the comparative historical goes back farther, but that's my 30-year adaptation. I'm saying what happened in 30 years. And so as you can see in 2010, Pittsburgh's creating jobs, Buffalo's losing them. Buffalo's got more unemployment. Buffalo is still losing people, lower per capita income. But Pittsburgh's got a hotter housing market showing some signs of a recovering economy. And if you look at that, those indicators of human capital, you see that almost 20% of the Buffalo's population in 2010 is without a high school diploma, whereas over a third of Pittsburgh's has a college diploma. So something happened in those 30 years that made those two cities go in vastly different directions. And then to add on, to compare so not only comparing to US cities, but then taking it to Latin America, I chose Cordoba. First, I wanted another federalist regime, or system, and Argentina is a federalist country, so at least I can control for that variable. Medium-sized, not a capital city, like Buffalo and Pittsburgh, industrial, high levels of immigration labor. For those of you who may not know, but Argentina has, a very similar history in many ways to the US early immigrant labor around the same time period, strong unionization, middle class built on that unionization and industrialization. And they experienced deindustrialization at a similar time period, but for different reasons, but around the time period. So that helps kind of keep some of the broader global issues controlled for. And they showed some resilience. And I wanted to do it to see what can Argentina teach us? So just to kind of explain, most of you know about US deindustrialization hit in the late or in the 70s. Some people said it was really coming around post World War II, but then there was enough industry in the World War II that kind of kept us going for a little bit. But by the 70s, the changes were really starting to hurt cities. And actually, many people say, or the assumption is that all those jobs went they either went to Southern US or they went to other countries. And many people assume that's always the Global South. The Global South has benefited at the expense of the Global North. The data on that is actually still, people are still doing that research, but what they're finding is that the Global South didn't gain as many jobs as we had thought. So that's even called into question, this idea of where did the jobs go. But the story in Argentina here is that the import substitution industrialization model was the one that was being used primarily. It was in Argentina up until the military coup of 1976. And they dismantled that. And that struck a really tough blow on Cordoba's industry. So that was that initial shock. But when I talked to people in Cordoba and they said, well, what really hurt Cordoba's industry, they'll cite these two periods. One, when the ISI model was dismantled, but secondly, during Carlos Menem's presidency, when it was a series of free market reforms that further took tariffs and protection away and exposed Cordoba's industry to competition, which hurt it. So let's look at resiliency is more difficult. This would be a good example of why comparative urban is challenging, because the numbers aren't going to look finding the data is very different, and that was hard. Not only is sometimes the Global South indicators harder to find, but then you go down to the level of the city, and even more difficult. But then furthermore, sometimes the comparisons are not the same. So first and foremost, I would say I put 3 columns in here because the comparison is not the same. Argentina has a unique trajectory, political and economic, and has gone through multiple economic crises. So to just show 30 years, assuming there weren't all these other crises, wouldn't be a fair depiction of what was going on there. So as you can see, arguably one of the worst crises was the crisis of convertibility, when Argentina decided not to peg their currency to the US dollar anymore. So when I look at, for example, unemployment, you go from 2.7, here's another comparative urban piece of, we know the informal sector in the Global South is much bigger. So these numbers are for unemployment should be taken with a grain of salt. But nevertheless, we'll take those numbers across time and see what we see. Very low in 1980. And you think, oh, well, it went up in 2010. And if you only looked at those two numbers, you think, well, does that show resiliency? But then you look at 2000 and what Argentina has been through. And in 2003, they had a 23.6 formal unemployment rate. So that doesn't even, that's not even capturing the full extent of it. And they got back to 7.2. So anyways, I won't go through all of these, but if you look at the last column and you look at how the sectors are divided, you see an awful lot of stability in the Cordoba economy. And there's a resiliency that they were able to maintain a significant amount of manufacturing despite the shock. And that's for various reasons. But anyways, this is my overall argument, just putting kind of that on the far left. I'm saying that cities that had conditions that allowed them to create this social connectivity early on were better able to get on that path when economic shocks struck. So the more connected you are, the better able you are to deal with the shock when it comes. And there's all these constraining variables depending on what city you are in, but that helps. Now, I should point out that I am not in this small n study arguing that social connectivity and intergovernmental support are the only variables that impact economic resiliency. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that these are these are important, and they played a role in Pittsburgh and Court of the Buzz resiliency, and in Buffalo's lack of resiliency. And that has not been looked at, and we have not really delved in to understand that in terms of political governance, especially. So quick story, if you don't know Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh is, many people said, connectivity is in our DNA. And many people think immediately of what they had kind of the quintessential urban regime was the Allegheny Conference on Community Development that was developed actually before deindustrialization in the post-World War II era. Business community came together with the government and said, we got to fix these flooding problems. We got to fix the pollution. We're turning on the streetlights in the daytime and look at urban renewal. And so they came together, and they kind of really have the classic governing coalition. But earlier, there's this long history of a city that had very early urban planning, very early collaborative urban planning, community councils embedded in the neighborhood. So a civic infrastructure that was there in the late 1800s, probably earlier, but from what I found evidence of, that kind of began to structure how folks in Pittsburgh connect and confront challenges. Then again, you can't talk about Pittsburgh without talking about their universities, both the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, huge players, very important players in Pittsburgh's innovation, economy, and reason for being able to bounce back. But what I found was that it wasn't just that each university did it alone. Each university, was very aware that their future was tied up with the future of Pittsburgh, and that did not happen in Buffalo. So they engaged in the civic life. They also collaborated with each other. They gave the green light for researchers all throughout the universities to collaborate and go after national grants together. So they were medium-sized, they weren't the powerhouses they are today when they began this. And actually more similar to the University of Buffalo in Buffalo. Foundations, they've got a lot of foundation money. So there's a lot of philanthropic investment in Pittsburgh, more so than in Buffalo. But again, there's been some studies done looking at the role of foundations in what we call legacy cities, these Rust Belt cities that are trying to bounce back. And the research has found that it's not the money alone, it's the broader ecosystem of the city, the governance, the business community, the connections, the collaboration. That is also what I found as I interviewed foundation leaders and even community members. They do nothing alone. They do nothing alone. Everything is in collaboration. They have roundtables and collaborative networks, and it's just fascinating. Actually, it's funny. A friend of mine who works in investment banking said, I was telling her about my research. She goes, "That's funny. I was just talking to an investment banker in Pittsburgh, and they were telling me how they all collaborate." And she said, "We don't do that in Chicago." So something's going on there. And the CDC's very strong community cohesiveness and the participatory processes. Mayor Pete Flaherty in the 70s initiated a community planning department And so, as you could see from this quote, one of the early planners who was in the department at the time said, at that point, we were doing the capital budget. And so we're the ones going out and talking to the community members, and we had first shot with the budget. So these little kind of ways in which institutions work, and if they are inclusive, make differences, especially over the long haul. And then I won't go too much into the state of Pennsylvania, but you could say they were an innovator early on in investment at the level of the city in promoting private-public partnerships, the innovation research, and Pittsburgh is kind of a powerhouse in terms of some of that change. So Buffalo, summary is they didn't do much of any of that. No significant planning for 30 years post deindustrialization. And obviously this is my hometown, but people just said to me, well, we were, it was like trauma. We were just stuck. We didn't know what to do. And actually in Pittsburgh, what many people said, the politicians were focused on getting steel back. So arguably the politicians in both Buffalo and Pittsburgh initially were kind of, trying to get the industry back that left. And really nobody knew that this was as long-term a structural change as it was at the time, right? So sometimes when you go into economic downturn, you don't know how long that's going, and you may not fully realize the extent of change in an economy. But anyways, Buffalo was not able to bridge. They didn't have a tradition of social connectivity. Politics really trumped civic goals. The business leadership, very myopic. When they were trying to figure out even where the University of Buffalo was going to be placed, there's evidence and documentation that some of the business leaders said, well, we can't have the university in our downtown. We can't have all those radicals from New York and people of color running around our downtown, which is very, that quote to me always, it's very indicative, because the other story about Buffalo is that they really had a very systematic exclusion of their African-American community, which was at the time when the jobs were there, a vibrant, middle-class, connected community. And the dominating white kind of WASP elite there was classic urban politics. Catholic immigrants got the politician jobs, the WASP got the corporate leadership, but they all kind of really excluded the African-American community. And New York State, I'll just mention this, New York State, I divide the time frame, because when Andrew Cuomo comes in, ironically, Andrew Cuomo is very helpful to Buffalo, invested over $2 billion, said, I'm going to help you guys out. People said, through the interviews, people said he's a mean guy, but he got stuff done. And they said, he told us we better all sit down at the table together or we're not getting anything. And multiple interviewees from across said, we had really never done that. We really never sat down together. But he mandates collaboration. They get a plan together, they get some money, and Buffalo's coming up, if anybody didn't know that yet. We don't yet know if it's gonna stick, is the best way to say it, but there's some kind of upturn. And then lastly, Cordoba. So when you take this out of the US, what do you see? You see similarities. So this is where the comparing is so difficult, because it's different. And so it was very clear there's a very strong civil society. Unions have a long history in Cordoba, political parties, community organizations, activists, people will go, they tell you time and time again, if we don't like what they do, we just take to the street. And so they take to the street. So street protest is a very, it's kind of part of their toolbox of civil society. There is connectivity between the business community and government, some with the community organizations, but less so, a little bit more business and politics. Stronger on participatory innovations. So they've got participatory budgeting, they've got these neighborhood centers, it's mandated that The community gets first dibs looking at the strategic plan, and then they give that to the mayor, who then has to then respond to them. So they have these, which the civil society had fought for that, but they have arguably more participation than we see in US cities. The irony is, and there's other research on this as well, participatory budgeting is mandated in a fair number of Latin American cities. But the folks in Cordoba, many said they don't trust it. They don't feel that because it's mandated, they think kind of the city is just doing a token, well, we're going to ask you what you think we should spend the money on, but that it's not a genuine grassroots bottom-up innovation, which that opens up another question about, when you have these great participatory innovations, what happens when you may be successful in mandating them? Do they lose the grassroots engagement, et cetera? That's another research project. Okay, so high levels of social capital. Somebody mentioned cooperatives. So Argentina is a great place to go to look at economic development and cooperatives. So when some of the factories closed, there's more examples of workers buying and kind of taking over the factories, kind of similar to, in Spain, the Mondragon cooperative, which is one of the kind of classic worker cooperatives. They also have these, they're called clubes de truque, and they're barter clubs. And so unfortunately, Argentina has had a lot of economic shock. Well, the citizens have learned a lot of coping mechanisms. And so, when they don't have money to go to the store, they created these barter clubs, and they go to their neighbors and they have certain meetups around the city, and they say, here, I've got a bag of potatoes. Do you have, something else that I need? Or I don't need this shirt anymore, but I need some food. And so that is what they've said is like they used it a lot after the 2001 crisis. And now recently after COVID, again, they kind of pop up and become more vibrant in times of need. So after deindustrialization, after the COVID or during the COVID crisis, which speaks to this idea of a path dependency. They know the tool. You can kind of hop back on that path more easily than, introducing that to a city that has never done it. So I guess I don't want to go into too much detail and bore you all with this. So, but for the federal government, the last part for Cordoba, I would say what it taught, it confirmed the power of intergovernmental support, but not only that the province of Cordoba is helpful to its city, which it is, and has significant funds, but even more, the city cannot go it alone, because if the national government has primary responsibility over macroeconomic policy and they can't get it together, the suffering at the level of the city is immense, as we all know. We sometimes forget it in the US because comparatively, macroeconomic policy has been fairly stable compared to many other places. But the Cordoba is just an example to not take that for granted, and that the federal government is a key player, and you can't understand the city without it. So I won't go into these, but examples of the path dependencies that I look at. And the key takeaways are that the more a business community, foundations, CDCs, communities, universities, and politicians, city council, mayors, the more that they are connecting with each other, my argument is that helps the city bounce back. And then what I'm saying is that good governance and good leaders can promote that type of collaboration, and actually need to. And when your city is very connected, you're able to get support from the state better. And I'll give you one example of that. In Pittsburgh, they after deindustrialization, these cities had no money. The tax revenues have fallen precipitously. So they couldn't keep paying for the libraries, the museums, some of the cultural capital of the city. And so all the different actors got together, even across jurisdiction. So the different municipalities in the greater Pittsburgh region. And they came up with this innovative structure called this regional asset district. And they convinced all of the municipalities and jurisdictions to vote for and propose that we will have an increased tax, but we're going to take part of it and we're going to give you the all the jurisdictions are going to get some of the money, and then 1% of that will go to the cultural capital of the Pittsburgh region. And so they were able to kind of come up with this, sell it to state government, and then get it adopted. So it's a great example of how the local actors didn't wait around and say, oh, well, our state's not doing anything. They kind of came up with ideas, got state in. Every time they went for money, they did it together. And in fact, at one point, one of the state legislators said, come back. This was early on. He said, come back with a plan together. And from then on, they never approached the state singly. And I'll give one other very recent comparison. This is before Cuomo was ousted. I was just reading the paper, and Cuomo had all the Buffalo legislators in his office saying, we're going to get all this federal money. We got to figure out what are the priorities. Well, it ended up in an argument and legislators left. Nobody coordinated. They had their same turf battles that they have had for decades. So connectivity helps to get some state support. Obviously, this is limited because comparative historical analysis necessarily depends on deep case-based research. So I can't generalize to all cities, but it does serve as a breadcrumb and a clue to begin to look at those things. It just for the future, one of the things I was personally torn by was this question of inclusion. And originally my research question is, well, you know, how do cities bounce back inclusively? And somebody, one wise professor once said to me, if they're not even bouncing back, or if they're not even cities that don't go through shock aren't inclusive, how are you going to ask, is a city that went through crisis coming back inclusively? You may not be able to kind of test that, but I want to continue down that road and understand the degree to which inclusion promotes economic bounce back. And there's research at the national and international level on that, especially in comparative politics. And then looking at kind of what do we pull out in terms of policy recommendations from some of this research. But before we go, I'm just going to stop for a second, see if you have any questions before we go on to some other
Maureen, usually we take a break at about this point for a few minutes just to give
Perfect.
everybody a chance to stretch and come back. So before we go to questions, or why don't we take a 10-minute break and come back at 5 after 5, and then we can pick up with the question section. Thank you very much for your presentation so far, Maureen.
Okay, thanks.
You know, Maureen, when you were talking about that, this is